couple things just to go through from a schedule standpoint, give you just an idea where we're at. Our calendar's kind of completed. There's 2 calendars we work off for the year. The calendar at the end of the year that takes us all the way to training camp, and then the second calendar is the one that we're able to put together once we're assigned our schedule, and that would go training camp through the end of the season. We're kind of in the midst, from a coaching staff perspective, of gathering all the information on our team. When we come back off a break, which will be next week, we'll spend a week on our roster, which I think obviously is real important relative to the evaluation process. It's only our second day since Sunday. I know there'll be a number of questions about staff, about none of that. We haven't even gotten into those discussions yet relative to any personnel, player-wise or coach, for that matter, anyone. That's just kind of where we're at. But we'll have a chance to go through all of that pretty thoroughly. I mentioned the other night after the game, you felt disappointment. Certainly I did. I know our players did. And, the key for us is not to lose track of that as we go forward and how that felt, because certainly there's an expectation level, and it's one of the reasons that made this job attractive is their success in their history. So we kind of start from where we're at right now relative to our team evaluation. Then we get into the evaluation of the other free agents in our league. And then it transitions to the draft. Throughout that process, we're evaluating, our scheme review offensively, defensively, in the kicking game. So we'll be busy, and yet there's a lot of work to do. So at that point, any questions?
Sean, Parker Gabriel from the Denver Post. What do you anticipate the next steps with Russell looking like going forward?
Look, I think that when we get back and we begin this process of looking at our roster, where we select, there's so many things that go into a decision specific to the quarterback, which is significant, obviously. So it's too early at all. I spent half an hour with Russ yesterday, and I told him, I said, look, I don't think it's going to be a long, drawn-out process, but it hasn't been decided relative to what our plans are. And but as soon as we know something that certainly, he would be the first to know.
Yeah, Sean, just what is your thoughts on your staff right now as far as, any changes you might make?
Well, like I said, the tough part of this presser always is the questions are good questions, but the cart's ahead of the horse. We've got, the next 2 weeks here, I'll be spending time with George, Greg, our coordinators, all of that stuff. And so, we'll look closely, just as we do our own roster, what we're doing. But, again, it's too early today to even get into any discussion. And I know, having done this 16 years, a lot of times the response is measured. In other words, the question has to be asked. Honestly, we just haven't started that process yet. And so I think the combine or the draft will be the next time when I have a chance to visit with you all, and probably there'll be things we know at that point in time that we're further along. But we're just as you get into the season, and I think you guys know this, everything is in relative to just game planning, and you get in a routine. And I think maybe some guys do it a little different, but our schedule is just starting now relative to those evaluations.
Sean, you're right.
Yeah.
Just following up on Russ, was the tenor of the discussion, there is a scenario where he's back with you next year?
Yeah, listen, otherwise it would have been like, hey, goodbye, and Yeah. And so I said that, I think, to you guys way back when. You know, we'll look at all the scenarios and try to do what's best for the Broncos. But communication will be important. And, yeah, that final decision hasn't been made.
You've said, Troy Rink from Denver 7, you've said that working with George Payton has gone well. Do you expect George to continue in his role?
Listen, we've had a real good working relationship from the beginning. And so all of that's gone well. Again, you know, we communicate 2, 3, 4 times a day. So yeah, that's worked out really well.
Arnie Stapleton, Associated Press. Sean, even with the cloud of uncertainty hanging over quarterback right now, can you look at your offense and feel like you've laid the foundation for your offense going forward?
Yeah, look, I don't know if you'd say laid the foundation. Look, our installation's in relative to how we call things, but the offense is ever changing relative to who's playing in it. You know, were we as good as we expected or wanted to be offensively this year? Absolutely not. And, you know, just looking at the numbers, you know, we'll go through red zone, we'll go through third down, we'll scheme review, all of that. I would say clearly, you know, still heavy duty work in progress. So I'd say we're not building on that foundation yet. We're still putting the frickin' pilings in based on what I saw. Fair enough?
Coach Zach Stevens, DNVR. With all the ups and downs of the season, with it being the first season with this team, would you say it was a success? And how do you view this season when you take a step back?
I don't. I have a hard time saying something like that because, yeah, I don't. My appetite's, I think, where it should be is a little bit stronger. And I said this at the start of the season, and it was really a discussion kind of off the record, but became, I felt like we had a chance, this team had a chance to get into the postseason. And I feel that same way now. So I'm disappointed because of that, and disappointed that I look back on a handful of things I could have done differently and better. And now, make no mistake about it, we finished where our record was. And we could point to a few games that would have gotten us to 9 or 10, but we could have pointed to a few games that got us to 6 real quickly as well. All right? And so that's generally the case each year. And so, yeah, no pass, fail, success, non-success. It is what it is. You know, it just leaves you know, a taste in your mouth that you look forward to the work, and you know, again, the tough thing about it is you don't get to erase it next Sunday. You know, here it is. That's the truth.
And Coach Eric Talala, DenverBroncos.com. When you look back at this year from when you took over, what is the biggest stride that was made, and what needs to happen to take the next step? Well,
look, I think we've begun to put a program in place relative to a foundation of, you know, this is coming up. We're not quite there the first full year. I guess when the players are back for OTAs, we'll mark, you know, maybe our first year. And I think that we have a better handle on where we're at as a team overall. I think that I think there is a grit element, and look, you go through this process, and our sport is a tremendous lab for human behavior. You know, it really is. And I'm not just talking about players, coaches, everyone. And you get to observe things, and I've got a pretty good memory, and I'm pretty sharp relative to certain things, and you know, you're that much further along with your own players in the process in the building, and certainly, you know, where we need to improve. In the beginning of year one, I don't know, you know, there's like that, I don't want to say old adage, but there's that approach where you have to go by what you see and make sure that you're not making too decisions too quickly, because there are a lot of players and people that are ready to win. And so I think we're further along that way. And yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I just think that we've begun to lay the foundation, and there's still a lot of work to be done.
Sean, Brandon Cristal, KOA Radio. I'll try to ask the question I'll ask the question I tried to ask Sunday about just anything that potentially surprised you broadly about, being here versus so many years in New Orleans, or about your team that surprised you.
I can't think of anything that's, look, two things. The two different times in my career we started off, 0-4, or here it was 1-5. The one thing that happened, you found that grit bounce back, kind of where we got to, and yet there's a lot of energy expended in doing that, and then in those prior two seasons, the results finished similar, and so you dig yourself in a hole, and there's quite a bit of energy to get back out of it. And even as we're sitting at that, as a coach, I'm thinking, all right, how do we prevent this from happening again? Meaning, what's happened where there's this exhale, and yet it still happened here. And so, like I mentioned, we played in a lot of close games. Our margin for error is what it was, and there were a few that, you're disappointed, I'm disappointed collectively that we didn't find a way to win, and yet there were a few games that we came back and made some plays at the end and got a win. So we've got a number of areas we've got to work at and improve. We'll have a lot of time. The calendar, as I'm putting it together, kind of began this week. We'll have a lot of time to do that. And the key is making the correct decisions relative to every part of the program, the procurement of talent relative to your own players, free agency, the draft. And I'm trying to think of the surprises, though. I mean, I don't know if there's anything that's like, oh, this is different. I mean, we have a larger press corps here than we had in New Orleans. I think that, but I think I would say this: it's important, obviously, to our fan base, and in a smaller level, but still significant way. It's very important, those people back there, and that's an attraction. I mean, coaching somewhere where it really matters a lot, I think is important, and I just think that that was an attraction here. Ownership was an attraction, and that's been fantastic. But those are the things that mattered, 8 months ago, and I can't think of anything that was uniquely different, really, or hadn't happened, or maybe having experienced something like it. I would say this: the time zone. When you're playing the games, the AFC, for my whole career, which is really more of a coincidence, but it's the first time ever being in the AFC and trying to figure out, who you're rooting against, as much as anything else. Looking ahead to our schedule next year, our opponents are set, our away opponents are set. We're going to have 4 or 5 Eastern time zone games. So that's something that's different. Like, all right, how do we handle traveling east? We didn't do well going to Miami, obviously. We didn't play well going to Houston. How do we handle, going that direction, especially when we're going to be playing, this many games and some pretty good teams in the AFC North, for instance. So looking at that part of the schedule and preparing that way, that's different than what I was used to.
Sean, Nick Hosmer of The Athletic, you mentioned that a week off for the staff, and then you come back and do those reviews. Is that important just to have the space from the season to?
Well, my experience has always been when we do those evaluations. So I've got however many years, call it 16 different sets of evaluations from prior teams. All those playoff teams, typically speaking, human nature, your team tends to be a little shinier, and so when you discuss, and I won't get into the specific grading system, but typically right off of a season, your grades, when you look back historically, I'm 10 years removed, and I'm looking at our 13 team, for instance, this morning, and I'm looking at the grades, and the uptick because of success exists, and the same thing can happen when you don't have success. That thing can move a little to the right. So the true key is to get as best as you can, an objective, clear, as close to accurate grade as possible. And I found over the years, sometimes the schedule doesn't allow it because of the postseason. When you get into the postseason, your calendar changes. It gets a little quicker or shorter. But I found that a gap from when you played to when you do that exercise is helpful. And I think in this case, it'll serve us well relative to the time.
Andrew Mason, DenverSports.com. You mentioned some of the things you thought you could have done better this season. In general, how would you evaluate the job you did as head coach this year? Well,
I said this the other day, and I just know how my peers and how I looked at it. Everyone would look at it as 8 and 9. That's how we're wired. So, like specifically, there'd be a number of things that I know better. That kind of thing where, like there's a notepad right now. I think for me, fresh off the season, all right, what are things as we get ready so that this time next year I'm not trying to remember. So there's a kind of a notepad I keep just of things that that we'll address or change or do differently heading into the season. But we're graded as head coaches. We're graded on our team's success as we should be, and that means sometimes we're overgraded. And then sometimes we're undergraded, but ultimately it's about winning, and that's always been pretty clear and clean and actually refreshing. So, the fact that we're having this on Tuesday, whatever week of January, it's not the right week. Certainly not the right week. For us and for when we'd like to be having this meeting.
Coach, Ryan McFadden from the Denver Post. I just want to get your thoughts on how would you evaluate how the defense was able to kind of like flip the script after the start of the season?
I thought it was important. Obviously, I think the biggest thing that stood out, was at that 1-5 benchmark. There were two things really. We rapidly changed how we were taking the ball away, and then we began to protect the ball. And so that was a deciding factor in a few games for us, the turnover ratio. And I don't, when you look at the exact numbers, but prior to that, they weren't real good. But I think that was a big reason behind our spark, if you will, of winning 5 games in a row, of creating field position. And honestly, we didn't always take great advantage of it offensively. We ended up kicking too many field goals, but nonetheless, I think that that was the one thing that stood out, our takeaways. And then I think we began to protect it a little bit better at that point. The season ended. We're an 8-0 team when we win the turnover battle, and we were 8-1 with winning it, and I believe we were 0-8 when it was even or we didn't win it. And so that's pretty typical of a team that's right in the middle of the pack, if you will. You know, the better teams will have 1 or 2 wins even when they lose it. You with me? And then the team certainly way down at the bottom might lose even when they win it. We sat there right at 5. You know, if we won it, chances are we won the game. But if we were even, I don't think we won a game where it was even. I think there was 1 or 2 examples where it was even, we didn't win. And so, but I think that was something that changed from week 7 on.
Right here, excuse me, Chris Thomas in Denver Gazette. The Broncos have potential salary cap issues. What sort of challenge is that, and how hard is it going to be maybe making some decisions on some veterans with big contracts?
Yeah, I would say your second question first. It's always difficult when you have to make decisions relative to players you've coached. Some of the hardest decisions of guys that I can just look back on certainly when you've had a history with players. The thing I told them that's important in yesterday's team meeting is, you know, we'll all leave the building and there'll be the different noise and buzz relative to, some of you will have more of it because you're an unrestricted free agent. Some of you may not have much at all. Just call, come by, visit. You know, the lines of communication, I think today more than ever, are really important. But I think that that's part of trying to figure out this game. The salary cap, those are challenges that every year you're familiar with. I'm familiar with it. And so there still is, yeah, I mean, there's, I think, 3 or 4 teams in the postseason this year that finished in the bottom 4 of our league relative to cap issues or dead money. And I'm not suggesting we're going to have either or one or the other, but that's part of the puzzle. Like, that's part of the puzzle. There was a time when the coach at this press conference would say, I'll see you guys after the draft, and he'd head to Palm Springs and come. It'd be 4 new players on the roster. They were the 3 rookies and 1, and it's much different now. It's year to year, and the fortunes can quickly change or quickly go the other way. And so it's a new puzzle every year, and that's what I began, obviously, to see over time, you know, having done this a while. So, you know, we begin that really in earnest this week.
Coach Scott Hastings, Altitude Sports. Every year in training camp, I ask players, what did they work on in the offseason? Going into the offseason, Sean Payton, the man, the coach, what's the one thing you'd like to improve on going into next year?
Well, there's a couple things. Our tight red zone was awful. You know, and so, all right, I got to look closely at, you know, my sequencing and what I'm doing, calling it. You know, inside the, what I mean by that is goal to go. We finished near the, you know, so our red zone numbers are past the 20, how many touchdowns, percentage, et cetera. You know, our opportunities, I think were decent. You know, I think we were 50-something that measured 9th or 10th. But inside the 10, first and goal to go, that wasn't good enough. Third down, you know, there were a handful of things, and many of you have asked great questions about, hey, your offense. And overall, you know, it was we collectively, starting with me, it wasn't good enough. We didn't take advantage of enough field position opportunities in games. I want to get my eyes fixed, so I call the right play and I don't mess up and call a wrong play on a play that happened one time this year. That was embarrassing. But I think here's the thing. I think it's easier when you get older and more secure with like who you are and what you do. And when you're younger, I think oftentimes you can be very defensive with certain things. The one thing that I know is how to win. And Like sometimes it may not be that you got 480 yards, but understanding the strength of your team and then playing to that. And I think one of the challenges that I had this year, all of us collectively, is like, man, how do we match up on the other side? How's this game unfolding? I know some of you had questions about a couple timeouts, but half-yard line, end of the first half against Vegas, I'm calling that timeout again 99 out of 100. Just look at the statistics or field position, balls, and the same one at New England, really. But I would say, man, we have to be great with the details, and obviously, we weren't good enough with the details if there were certain mistakes that were repeating themselves. And so that starts with our teaching, our coaching. Are we saying the right things? But the 10-yard line in sticks out. That's unusual. That bothered me a lot because you have, those are 4-point swings, really, if you kick a field goal instead of score a touchdown. I'm sure as we go through this process, there's going to be a number of other things. But I think that, I think that I'm comfortable and far enough along doing this where it's like, hey, that I can easily be swayed or moved by even coaches. Like it's one thing to be somewhere where everyone tells you what you want to hear, but the value of a coach that tells me sometimes what I need to hear, I appreciate. Is that it? All right, thank you guys.